It's not often I'm in the company of such esteemed guests, and apologies to my family, friends and colleagues, but today I'm delighted to be joined by Lord Rupert Redesdale to discuss, amongst other things, how changes in carbon regulation and policy can be monitored by our ambition and achievements. And we'll get to learn what drew Lord Redesdale to becoming a champion for carbon reduction and ultimately to found both the Energy Management and Carbon Management Associations, amongst others. Lord Redesdale was the Liberal Democrats' energy spokesman for the House of Lords between 2000 and 2008, during which time he introduced a number of private members' bills in the area of energy and conservation. As Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Climate Change Group, he spread the message about the carbon costs of energy. In 2009, Lord Redesdale founded the Anaerobic, Digestion and Biogas Association, of which I hope I pronounced that correctly, but no doubt you will challenge me if not, which has over 260 companies. In 2012, he was awarded the accolade of Environmental Parliamentarian of the Year by the Chartered Institute of Water and Environmental Management. Lord Redesdale is the founder of the Energy Managers Association, Carbon Management Association and Low Energy Company. These organisations aim to promote the development of energy management and the career structure of energy managers in the British economy, setting standards and auditing companies against their commitment to energy management. Lord Redesdale, thank you for joining us. You're very welcome.
Thank you.
How was my pronunciation of anaerobic? Is that right?
Anaerobic.
Anaerobic, apologies.
Not that it wasn't the easiest of titles. Yeah.
It wasn't the easiest of titles, and I must say, nor was the. I think I tripped over parliamentarian as well, so apologies. But thank you so much for joining us, and on behalf of Spaces, we're delighted to have you, and you're very welcome. We're very pleased to be talking to you. And when you were first talking to us, it was to present the keynote speech, and unfortunately we can't do that in person today. But we will get to some of those key themes that you were going to discuss with us. But first of all, what I wanted to do was just go back a little bit in history, if I may, and ask you whether you were always an environmentalist, or did this develop over time, and why is this so important to you?
I suppose, yes, I've always been interested in the environment, but I really sort of started looking at climate change around about 2000 because the science was changing, but it was quite clear that it was going to have an impact, and the science has been borne out. But it's taken so long for people to actually really take it seriously, and the only time they start taking it seriously is when you actually see the impact on the climate.
And at what point, what was the catalyst in 2000 that suddenly made you champion this cause?
I suppose really it was, I'd been defence spokesman and fighting against the Iraq War, and was quite exhausted by that point. Really, during the summer of 2000, there was a lot of information coming about the melting of the Arctic shelf. We were starting to talk about tipping points that, if we go past, we won't be able to actually bring the climate back again and, stop the changes. And one of the really depressing things is that we sort of started setting targets from them, and we've gone past every single one of those targets. And now we're setting targets of 1.5 degrees, but if we don't change dramatically, we're on course for 4 degrees, and that will make parts of the Earth uninhabitable.
And geographically speaking, if we quantify that to perhaps areas that people might recognise, where might be uninhabitable?
North Africa, yes, Texas. They're talking about 50-degree heat. So if you take that band, you can't survive in 50 degrees heat. So you're talking about a band in the centre that during summer periods will not be able to be habitable.
And as you mentioned, they're areas that people recognise absolutely. So it has a real.
Well, we're already seeing the knock-on effect. I mean, industry has been moving north because water is becoming much more scarce. And there's certain things that you've got to start realising. Even if you're looking at buildings at the moment, which is in the Thames area. Within the next 4 or 5 years, we will run out of water. Supply won't won't be able to match demand. And it gets worse from there on in. And we always have this view of Britain being a wet country, and it's not becoming a wet country. It's becoming a dry winter country, and the rainfall patterns has changed. And this is a really interesting one for local authorities, because we're going to get a lot of flooding, because all our drains are built around 1950s specification. You know, and the 1950s rainfall. Well, if you have these massive downpours that we're getting at the moment, you know, the drains aren't even built to deal with that. So it's a fundamental infrastructure issue we'll be looking at as well.
Which, and I suppose that's interesting, particularly if our audience members perhaps looking to a large extent at the built environment, but certainly flooding and infrastructure associated with that absolutely is going to play a huge part in the developments that we're looking at, and to note the infrastructure and the services perhaps that are underground that are supporting the building development that our market's looking at. So it's an interesting juxtaposition.
Well, it is. We're into the adaptation stage. We've missed the avoidance period. We're now going to have to deal with that. So, I mean, a report came out recently that said we could lose 200,000 houses to flooding. You know, on the models of sea level rises. So, yeah, we are really going to have to start thinking of the buildings of the future being designed in a different way, and how we look at drainage, how we look at solar gain on buildings. You know, can we carry on building, you know, glass structures when the temperature goes up considerably?
Absolutely, and the financial consequences of putting in these adaptations is going to be huge as well, and I think we'll perhaps touch upon that in a moment or two. Sadly, as I mentioned before, sadly it's not possible to deliver your keynote to us in person today, but I'd be grateful if you could touch on the themes for us that you were going to outline for our members.
Well, I think really it's a question of now looking at adaptation and what we can actually do to reduce the amount of energy we're using. This view that we can carry on business as usual, I think really has to be challenged. We have to start looking at the carbon costs of all our operations, but not just in the short term. If you're looking at buildings, I've been talking to a lot of steel manufacturers. You know, if you're building a building for the future, should it ever be knocked down, should you not keep the steel infrastructure and the foundations and repurpose the building? So we're entering a new sort of stage where the throwaway culture, which is from, you know, everyday objects right up to buildings, has to change. And we've got to start looking at how we're going to be using those buildings in the future. A really interesting one that came out of the pandemic was doing the carbon calculations on people working from home. Because if when people are working from home during the winter, during the summer it's fine, but during the winter they're powering up their heating systems at home, and when, you know, if you go into the office, all those workers are actually turning off the heatings in their buildings. But we're ending up with, you know, the offices being heated and people's homes being heated. So I think it's quite an interesting carbon calculation. Of course, then you have to add in transport, and if people are driving in, well, then it's better for them to work at home. So sort of questions about how quickly we need to go, as against this sort of stop-start signals we're getting from the government when there seems to be COPs coming along. It's in the newspaper. At the moment, climate change really isn't in the newspaper.
No, true, but yet they're linking it to, you know, the energy crisis that we're facing. So I think us as, I suppose we have us as an industry, and then we have us as consumers, and I think us as consumers are very much aware of the rising cost and the winter fuel poverty, and how many of us are going to be directly impacted. I suspect all of us in some way, shape or form.
Well, this is where I find it, you know, strange, because it's as if consumers believe that politicians can control the cost of energy. So the problem we've had is energy's been very, very cheap during the pandemic, energy went to almost historic lows against. So what we're now seeing is a massive increase from that historic low in a very, very short period of time. And where it's been exacerbated is this price cap stupidity, which is the government introduced a price cap. The price cap actually was thought up by Ed Miliband one afternoon. Didn't check it with anybody, just announced he was going to do it. Everybody laughed, but then it was seen as very popular in polling. So Theresa May brought it in. And the stupidity of this is we ended up with a marketplace where companies were making very small margins, but betting on the future. Now we've had the massive increase in costs. The price caps mean that most of the smaller companies have gone out, and a lot of the larger companies are in trouble. And prices will go further up. Because in the past it's always been linked to the oil price. But of course, gas is now the one that everybody's looking at, and there will, I think, be a decoupling of oil and gas prices. And there's no real reason why gas prices should fall in the medium term.
So, Lord Redesdale, there's a lot to talk about in relation to ambitions to achieve net carbon zero. But in your opinion, how realistic is it, and is the net aspect of it really a half measure?
So I think this is an interesting point, because net carbon zero came out of a report by the Climate Change Committee that basically put the UK on the road to net zero in 2050. So the idea is that the country should be able to, net zero doesn't mean we'd be producing no carbon, but it means we'd be taking carbon out of the atmosphere. One of the depressing aspects of the report is some of the technology we need to actually achieve that gain doesn't exist at the moment. So we almost need to create that. But there are measures in there which would massively reduce the amount of energy the energy we're using, therefore the carbon we're emitting. So it has a number of steps forward. So when companies are talking about becoming net zero, a lot of them are setting targets before 2050, but many of the companies don't understand what that's going to entail. So it is going to mean a fundamental change in how people live their lives, but how they use buildings, how they use different technologies. So it's going to also include how you work around transport, whether you move to online, how you decarbonize your supply chain, and how you, most importantly, in the short term, how you reduce the amount of energy you're using as a company straight off. There's a second term which a lot of people are using at the moment, and that's carbon neutrality. So people are setting a net zero target of probably between 2030 and 2040 or 2050. But companies also talking about being carbon neutral. And that means that they'll try and reduce their carbon to such an extent, and then with the remaining carbon, they'll use offsets to try and reduce that carbon. I think people are going to have to be very careful of that, because offsetting is a tricky problem, and the science behind it is developing.
And I think I wonder, just from discussions I've had with people, certainly across the public sector, whether there is not an argument to say that the offsetting aspect becomes more of an accounting issue, as opposed to us actually removing carbon from our buildings, our supply chain, our operations, as it were.
Definitely. My own view is offsetting, and I'm actually doing a lot of work on offsetting at the moment, shouldn't be considered until the very last point, if you really want to do that. Spending the money you were spending on offsetting on reducing the amount of emissions you're making at the moment is a far better route forward.
Yeah,
so it's easy to get out of jail free card.
And that's where I was gonna go with it. And I wonder whether or not there might be moves then to we talked about price capping earlier on. Actually, whether there should be moves to offset cap in terms of the amount of your, I don't know whether it's your revenue or whether it's your profit or whether it's whatever metric you choose to apply to say that it can't be more than 0.3% of your.
Well, yeah, but a lot of people are sort of saying, right, okay, it's probably the last 10% we're going to offset. But that all depends whether you can do it or not. So certain industries can reduce their carbon by going to, say, green electricity. But that's not going to help heavy industry because you need the energy from gas. So they're now looking at green hydrogen, which is a technology that's coming up, but it's not actually a mature technology at the moment. So it's very much a sort of a question that companies are going to have to ask. You were talking about the councils, though. It did make me laugh. I was talking to one council who said, our target is 2038. And I was trying to work out why their target was 2038, and it turned out the next door council's target was 2040. So it wasn't based on science-based targets, it was based on
one-upmanship. Absolutely. And I've heard similar tales to that as well. I mean, we talked a bit. You mentioned when we were talking about the flooding issue. We touched just briefly on the financial consequences of that, and funding is very much a key issue for our sector. And again, you mentioned COP26 earlier on, and I'm wondering whether that made any real world provision for funding. And in the UK, does government need to take an innovative approach to what is otherwise traditional local authority capital/revenue funding models, which are quite binding to deliver the services they've got to deliver?
One of the best things that came out of COP26, as far as I was concerned, was the target set by the financial institutions over their lending criteria. So they won't lend money now unless it's linked to carbon reduction. And that's going to have a massive effect on lots of companies. And it means certain things like coal power fast stations already can't get any financing, even in China. So we're moving to a point where during the procurement process, there's going to be an enormous amount of pressure, not just on, coal power fast stations. It's going to be on everybody to prove that they've done as much as they can to reduce their carbon. And I think, I've seen it in a number of sectors, especially, say, in the metal sector, where people want lower carbon steel, and cement is looking at the moment. So I think it's going to come down into councils through procurement processes. They're going to actually, so it's a sort of, there's much more pressure coming on companies providing services. And to me, I think local councils, a really good example is that waste contracts. When local councils made procurement and waste contracts dependent on meeting all environmental goals, so you couldn't win a waste contract just on price, you had to automatically mean those. It completely changed the way the waste industry acted. And I think that is coming down. But there is a second point, which is about finance. I've seen a lot of finance coming through, not on energy efficiency, because it's very difficult to get that through on savings, but purely on net zero targets. And that is something that has happened in the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and a lot of the clients I work with are certainly using SALEX funding, public sector decarbonisation scheme funding, to enable them to look at their assets and start to decarbonise their assets. And in terms of property assets, buildings, I mean, would your approach be that the way local authorities are going to make a step change is perhaps looking at what we would deem a sort of fabric first kind of approach, i.e. change your infrastructure that you have in front of you first before you try and tackle these larger scale, perhaps slightly more intangible schemes about decarbonising your whole asset portfolio as a sort of a one-off hit over sort of 3 or 5 years, because it's going to be such a difficult piece to implement, because we buy and sell assets all the time across our sector. Some are, community buildings that really just need a little bit of love and a little bit of investment. Some are assets that we've held, civic buildings that we've held that we know as we sort of scratch off the surface of the wallpaper, sort of riddled with asbestos and other things dating back many, many years. So it's a hard beast to try and tackle.
It is a hard beast, but I think if you look at some of the big property companies, they're already making this move. If you look at Land Securities, there was 27 acres around Victoria that they redeveloped. And one of the main reasons they did that was because its EPC level was going to be E or D. Well, it was probably going to be E, and their view was they wouldn't be able to rent it out. And of course, there's the other thing, which is, energy costs going up in the future. Can you afford to actually maintain those assets going forward? I mean, I think we might have moved past the point where those people occupying the buildings are quite happy to have a massive energy bill. And that's changing as well. So there is a real argument. I mean, I've seen a lot of 60s style buildings just being demolished because there is nothing you can do with them. And schools are a classic example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that's going to really take precedence in terms of how, certainly across the local authority sector, how it sort of relays out its asset portfolio within a geographical space, as it were. If you knock down one school, you've got to have already provided that facility for those students somewhere else. And with the amount of housing development that's going on, actually those pupil places for the new schools that we're looking at are already going to be oversubscribed with an 8 or 10 form intake school. So then you think about, well, that small school that's been there that might have 300 or 400 students and maybe 3 or 4, like a 2 or 3 form intake, can't be absorbed within this new space. So it's a complicated model.
It's a very complicated model, but we did some work recently, and actually if you wanted to make short-term carbon gains, major short-term carbon gains, basically you would then prioritize backlog maintenance as almost an infrastructure cost. Because, if maintenance has disappeared, and it's being put off to such an extent. But if you actually look at the energy systems you're running, you've got air conditioning where the filters are blocked, you've got all these sort of things, but people don't do it because they want to do, if you could put solar panels on, great, but actually maintaining the systems they've got.
And that's in my experience, that's as a direct result of the model of funding that I touched upon earlier. So maintenance is all about revenue funding, and year on year those revenue funds are reduced, and therefore there's not enough to go around. So you have to then prioritize your building revenue funding, and that competes against your social services funding, against your against your education funding, against your adult care funding. So there's lots of competing agendas for that revenue.
Well, I remember an example, and I was called the land security Boots conundrum. So Boots completely control all their stores externally, because of course they can control entirely how it's worked. So in theory, somebody going into Boots can't turn on or turn off the lights because that's been done externally and it's been controlled. So it can be, but land security rent out 10% of London's office space, but they're not legally allowed to go into the buildings without permission. So they can't actually control their own property or how their property is used. So there's enormous amounts of inefficiency in that. So yeah, there's so many moving parts to this.
Yeah, and I suppose that was part of my question earlier around that innovative use of, whether government will allow more innovative use of the funding to be able to use, to be able to perhaps work up a slightly better model of capital and revenue split, so you don't end up with what is over a period of time, over 15 or 20 years, a huge disinvestment in your property assets because you can't afford to do the basic things. So you strip back on the things that you want. And a very real example, and one that I've been working with a client of mine, is that, over a period of years, they said, well, look, we won't do our gutter maintenance on these buildings because actually we can save ourselves £2,000 a year by not having someone run up a ladder and check these things. And actually not doing that on a particular building. There was some water ingress that leaked into the timber frame of the roof joists, and before you know it, you've got a £300,000 or £400,000 roof replacement over, by the time you next come to check that. So very small amounts of money, relatively speaking, would have saved a significant amount further down. And it's just trying to find, at the moment, I think the scales are tipped the wrong way, not in favour of local authorities to best manage these assets. And I wonder whether there might be a bit of levelling up on that side to be done.
Well, you see, this is why I like the whole movement of the debate to carbon rather than energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is a really difficult one to sell because you're selling something that doesn't exist. And the more you spend on it, the more it doesn't exist in the future. So it's, and people, you say you're going to make a saving, the board are already in their own minds has spend that saving, even though the saving is meant to pay for the measure. I think with the carbon calculation, that's a really interesting one because it's an absolute on the building that you've got to try and reduce. So there are some easy measures to start with, but they become more and more complicated. If you're doing an energy performance contract, there's 273 interventions you can make into the building. But as you go further down the chain, they become more expensive and more difficult to do. So people tend to do just the very, LED lighting or something like that, because of how do you justify triple glazing with a 25-year payback. But if you do it on a carbon calculation, then it makes it an easier sell. And I think that moving to that, it does mean the government comes up with pots of money you very quickly have to spend tomorrow, or it gets clawed back on Thursday. It's that sort of, it is a problem, but I think it might be a different way of looking at the metrics of a building. And it gives you, and if you then add a whole of life cycle, it gives you a very nice indication of should you be keeping that building at all, and if you are, should you be stripping it right back to basics.
And I think there's a lot to be done in that area, and I suppose it's certainly hard for some local authorities to have the thinking space, if you like, to be able to take themselves out of the day-to-day operational work that's going on and really look strategically across the portfolio and do that horizon scanning to say, right, okay, well, what is it we absolutely fundamentally need? What is it that we think we can lose? How do we mitigate that loss with the community, the communities that currently utilise that space? What are we going to? There's such a large tapestry of things that are all interrelated in there. So it's a difficult job for local authorities at the moment.
It is, but if you push it into the procurement argument, suddenly it becomes easier. So if you actually say, right, because local authorities spend an enormous amount of money. So if you're saying on all your contracts, you've got to meet these carbon objectives, then it actually pushes right up and down the supply chain people into thinking about carbon as a central element of it. And of course, we always talk about carbon as if it's something separate. It's basically energy, because you only burn fossil fuels for energy. So it's sort of the energy flows within a building. How do you move forward? I mean, there's some really interesting stuff that could come down the line. Like I was talking to some people about using DC rather than AC in buildings, because you could reduce by about 30% the power in a building and take out all transformers. Of course, you could do it in such a way that you don't kill the occupants, but you can also use DC wires for internet connections. So in theory, you could have one line running into the office rather than 30.
Okay, interesting.
So it's really interesting, and that is technology that could have been matured by now. But of course, it's one of those ones that people look at and go, oh, well, yeah, it's too difficult to do. And I think we're going to have to start looking at that. But I think one of the things I'd say with all the councils is taking a slightly longer view, because I've been talking to some developers, and of course, when you're looking at a very large development, you put in the specs very early on. So I was actually talking to one of the big property portfolio people who'd just built a building, and then they had to rip the lighting out because to put new energy efficiency lighting in. But they put the lighting in because that's what the contract said. rather than saying, okay, well, that was 5 years ago, and the energy, you want LED, you want the latest stuff. So I think we're going to have to start thinking much more of how we build it into ongoing contracts.
Yeah, and I think there is absolutely something in there that once you sort of have a design freeze and specification freeze on your building that goes out to tender, that's what they deliver. And as you rightly say, that could be 2 or 3 years prior to the occupation and practical completion of the building. And as building regulations change as well and new emerging technologies come into play, actually there's a cost involved in bringing these things into the spec. There's another interesting point you raised, which was around the sort of repurposing of materials. Can we reuse the steel frame of that site? We can knock everything else out, but can we repurpose some of the kind of core components of that building? And there will be certainly some legislation changes and regulation changes that I'm guessing need to be in place to ensure, particularly where it's things like concrete and steel, that they're not compromised in any way through the existing use or perhaps the taking down of materials around it as part of the now.
I mean, I've looked at a couple of these schemes. Retrofitting buildings is really expensive. So I think we should be building buildings now, realizing that, we might have to repurpose how it's looked. But, modern buildings are basically a steel box with lots of girders running around it. So you can knock them back to that. And I think it is very much saying, okay, what materials should we use? And how should we actually look at building in redundancy so that if it's to be used again, there are fixing points. Good.
And possibly financial incentives as well, because I think that would certainly encourage the supply chain to be thinking about how they best repurpose.
Yeah, I mean, for the supply chain, it can be awful because, you could say that we shouldn't build any new buildings and we should just repurpose old buildings. And you look at London and all the, especially places like King's Cross. But I find King's Cross a classic case, which is, when you look at the infrastructure of the big tower blocks they're putting up, most of the stuff that's going around it is fascia that's put on, just pasted on afterwards. So you can take that off, you can change it, but we really know, I've worked in Qatar for a while. The idea of building a glass tower block in Qatar is nuts. The solar gain is appalling, and then when you get a sandstorm, you have to wash it all off with water that costs unbelievable amounts and is environmentally unfriendly.
Yeah.
So we when we're looking forward, these great buildings, which an architect's dream, should we be going right back to the beginning and saying the architect's dream is one thing, but it needs to be tapered to an environmental life cycle?
I think that's a really good point. And actually, as you start to sort of focus on what the future looks like for that building, tell us a little bit about what excites you about the future journey to carbon zero.
I think what I like is going back to the very basics of some of the stuff that was actually introduced in the late 1800s, early 1900s, which is the idea of naturally ventilating buildings, heating and cooling systems, in place. I saw a great one recently, which was a tile system which sucks the air out into the building when it's very hot and takes the temperature off, but then dissipates that heat during the night. So it's a natural system of actually dealing with the building. I think, people are moving forward. There's going to be a great problem when we move totally to electricity. Do we actually have enough? I mean, I quite like it. I've just been looking at some charging solutions. And a fast charger at a motorway charging point to the size that, is going to be significant is the same as the electricity to 500 homes.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, we're talking about serious pieces of drawing power. How do we actually make sure that the grid survives that? Is an interesting one. But it's getting back to how we use buildings as well. I mean, and it's never as easy as starting with the building that you're designing now. I mean, we were looking for awards with the energy managers of people who had done who had done most with least. And we had one energy manager who had a building where everybody was used to coming in and using the thermostat. And what he did basically was he turned around and said, they were coming in when they were cold, turning the thermostat up. Everybody in the building's too hot, they turn the thermostat down. The building can't deal with that. So the way I got round it was he brought everybody together and gave them a lecture on how to use the thermostat in the best way it was. I said, I bet that didn't work. He said, no, it did work. I said, how? He said, well, then I decoupled the thermostat. So whilst they were turning up and down, it looked great and everybody felt happily because psychologically they were in control of the building. He said, but obviously, the building was controlled centrally.
That's a good cultural way of tackling it. The placebo effect on a grander scale.
Yeah.
So just one final question for you, really, and I suppose it's really whether there's sort of one, I don't know, must-read book, article, or something that radically changed your thinking about this that you would want to share with our audience.
Actually, funnily enough, I would go to the Climate Change Committee's 2050 Net Zero document, the original one. You can download it. It's quite a weighty tome. But what's good about there is it actually goes through all the different elements. So instead, it gives you a sort of a much more holistic approach to how we look at climate change. And there is some good news stories in there, because we always look at the negatives. One of the good news stories is a massive cause of carbon, of course, is eating meat. So one of the ways of actually a major reduction in the amount of carbon we emit, and especially methane, would be for people to go vegetarian or vegan. And since the report has been written, and now, we far outstripped the number of people who are going vegetarian than was in the report. So one of the good things, and to me, the good news story is people's perceptions change massively. People believe in climate change, but actually doing something about it is a problem. You may believe in climate change, but if it means you can't take a flight to go on holiday, you sort of put it in the back of your mind. But we are going to have to make those changes. But we are going to be seeing the effects of climate change on our weather as much as anything else. So, we've just had 3 of the hottest days of the year, and there were record-breaking temperatures. That sort of change gets into people's psyche.
It does. And on that good weather story, Lord Redesdale, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really kind of you to make the time. And for those that are here at the study day with us today, please enjoy the sessions we have lined up for you. For those that can't be here in person but are joining us online, please enjoy the presentations that are being made, and we hope you have a wonderful day today. Just to sign off, I'm Alex G. I hope to see you again for another Spaces podcast. Thank you very much.